We were briefed on the mission a few days before heading out. It sounded simple enough. Head into a remote region near coast, gather intel on potential insurgent activity, and get back to base. Nothing we hadn't done before. The area had a reputation. Sure, locals called it the Crow's Nest because of some old legend, but I didn't pay attention to that. I never did. My focus was on the mission, on my team. Riley, Lee, Ramirez, Walsh, they were solid, experienced, and we'd been through worse together. We were dropped just before dawn, the mountains looming in the distance, covered in a thick tangle of trees and rock. As we moved deeper into the terrain, something felt different. Not in any supernatural way, but more in how the land seemed untouched, abandoned. No signs of people, animals, or even the usual scattered debris you'd expect to see in an area with any history of conflict. Just pure wilderness. After a few hours, we came across what looked like an abandoned camp. There were signs of a struggle, overturned supplies, a tent half collapsed, and blood smeared across a few rocks. It was fresh. No bodies, though. We searched the area, but nothing explained what had happened. Lee made some joke to cut the tension, but nobody laughed. We packed up quickly, getting the hell out of there. There's a certain feeling you get when you know you're walking into something that's already gone wrong. I had it then. The further in we went, the harder it became to focus. Little things started bothering me. Riley was too quiet, Lee was fidgety, and Ramirez kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected to see something following us. I brushed it off. It was just the tension of the mission, right? But even I couldn't ignore the growing sense that we were being watched. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to close in around us. I didn't know. Around dusk, we set up camp. Walsh tried to get a signal out on her radio, but nothing was working. Just static. "We're on our own tonight," she said, giving me a look that told me she wasn't thrilled about it. Riley stayed on watch while the rest of us tried to rest. I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the sky, feeling this strange weight in my chest. Something was wrong. We all felt it, but none of us wanted to say it out loud. By the time I drifted off, it was already late. When I woke up, the air was different. There was no sound, no movement, and when I looked around, Riley was gone. Riley was supposed to be on watch, but he wasn't anywhere near the camp when I woke up. I felt my gut tighten as I looked around, trying to shake the grogginess from my head. I nudged Ramirez, who was still half asleep beside me. "Where the hell's Riley?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Ramirez blinked at me, his face scrunched with confusion, and then looked over at the empty space where Riley should have been sitting. We both got up quickly, searching the area around the camp. Walsh was already awake, fiddling with the radio, her face pinched with frustration. Lee, still waking up, noticed the commotion and joined in. "He wouldn't just wander off, right?" Lee muttered, scanning the tree line. "Riley's too solid for that," I said, more to convince myself than anyone else. But the more we looked, the more it didn't add up. His gear was still there, untouched. His rifle, his pack, it was like he'd just stood up and walked into the woods with nothing. I didn't like it. Not one bit. Walsh kept trying to get a signal, the radio spitting static and cutting in and out. "We should have some kind of reception out here," she muttered. She paused, looking up at me. "This doesn't make sense, Harris." "Nothing about this makes sense," I snapped, but immediately regretted it. I was rattled. I wasn't used to this. Men disappearing without a trace, no signs, no noise, no struggle. It felt wrong, like the ground beneath us was shifting, but you couldn't see it. We set out to find Riley. Lee led the way, his rifle raised, every step careful. We called his name, but nothing came back. I could tell Ramirez was spooked. His eyes kept darting to the trees, and the longer we walked, the more jumpy he got. At one point, he swore he saw something, movement just ahead, a flash of black. But when we got there, nothing. Just more trees and rocks. We kept pushing deeper into the trees, calling Riley's name, but there was nothing. It was like the forest swallowed up every sound we made. Lee was at the front, moving cautiously, his eyes scanning every shadow. Ramirez was sticking close to me, quiet, too quiet for him. Normally, he'd have some sarcastic remark or a complaint, but not now. He was too busy checking the tree line like he expected something to jump out at us. After about an hour, I could feel the frustration boiling over. We weren't getting anywhere. He wouldn't have just disappeared, I muttered to myself, but I knew the others were thinking the same thing. A Marine doesn't just vanish, especially not someone like Riley. It didn't make sense. Then Lee stopped dead in his tracks. He held up a hand, signaling for us to be quiet, and crouched down. "What is it?" I whispered, stepping forward. He pointed to the ground, and that's when I saw it. Tracks. They were faint, barely visible in the dirt, but they were there. Footprints. And they weren't Riley's. Too small, too shallow. "Those aren't his," Lee said, echoing my thoughts. "Someone else was out here." Ramirez let out a shaky breath. You think someone took him?" The idea hung in the air, and no one wanted to answer. If someone had taken Riley, why didn't we hear anything? There was no struggle, no sign of a fight. It didn't add up. We followed the tracks for another 100 yards before they stopped at a clearing. It was a small, open patch surrounded by thick trees, and in the middle was what looked like a makeshift altar, just rocks piled on top of each other, with some kind of markings scratched into them. I felt a chill run down my spine. It didn't belong here. None of this did. Lee stepped forward, studying the rocks. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. I didn't have an answer. Neither did Ramirez. The whole thing felt wrong, like we were intruding on something we weren't supposed to see. Lee crouched by the rocks, running his fingers over the markings, his face twisted in confusion. "These aren't Afghan," he said, shaking his head. "Not anything I've seen." I moved closer, my gut telling me we shouldn't be there, like we'd stumbled onto something we were never meant to find. Ramirez hung back, his eyes darting from the trees to the rocks, his rifle gripped too tight. He was scared. We all were, though no one would say it. "What do we do, Sarge?" Walsh asked, her voice low, almost like she didn't want to break whatever spell had settled over the clearing. I didn't have an answer. There was no protocol for this, finding tracks that led to a creepy altar in the middle of nowhere, our guy missing without a trace. I glanced at the markings again, trying to make sense of them, but they didn't look like any language I'd seen. They were rough, jagged, like someone had scratched them into the stone in a hurry. Something about them felt old, ancient even, but it wasn't a feeling I could explain. "We keep moving," I finally said, though every part of me wanted to turn around and get the hell out of there. Riley could still be close. Even as I said it, I knew how it sounded. Close? He'd been gone for hours, and we had no sign of him beyond the tracks. Ramirez gave me a look, like he was thinking the same thing, but didn't want to say it. As we turned to leave, I heard it. A whisper, faint, almost like it was carried on the wind. My name. Harris. I stopped, my blood running cold. I looked back at the others, but no one else seemed to have heard it. Lee and Walsh were already moving, but Ramirez was standing still, staring at me. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, his face pale. "I heard it too," he said. His voice was shaking, and that scared me more than anything. Ramirez was a tough kid, the kind of guy who didn't flinch under pressure. But now he looked like he'd seen a ghost. We started walking faster, sticking close to each other. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves had us on edge, our nerves shot. I kept replaying that whisper in my head, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just the wind, just stress. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was following us, something we couldn't see, and it knew our names. By the time we made it back to camp, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over everything. Rayleigh was still missing, and the radio was useless. Nothing but static no matter what Walsh tried. I called it for the night, telling everyone to keep close, keep their weapons ready. No one argued. We all felt it now. We didn't sleep that night. Not really. I kept the fire going, more for comfort than warmth, the flickering light casting long, shaky shadows over the camp. Ramirez sat across from me, staring into the flames, his rifle resting on his lap. He hadn't said much since we got back, just kept looking over his shoulder, eyes darting into the dark. I knew the feeling. Every sound, every crack of a branch had me gripping my weapon tighter, waiting for something to come at us from the trees. Walsh kept trying the radio, but I could tell she was done hoping for a signal. She muttered something under her breath about interference, the mountains messing with reception. We both knew that wasn't it. The radio had worked fine earlier. It wasn't the terrain keeping us cut off. It was something else, something I couldn't name. Lee was pacing the perimeter, back and forth, his boots crunching against the dirt. The tension was getting to him, to all of us. "Maybe Riley made it back," Walsh said, her voice soft but not hopeful. "Maybe he's waiting for us." I didn't have the heart to tell her what I was thinking. Riley didn't make it anywhere. And whatever took him, whatever was out there in the trees, wasn't done with us. But I had to keep the team together, had to keep them moving. I nodded, trying to keep the doubt from showing. Around midnight, Ramirez broke the silence. "Did you hear that?" His voice was low, urgent. I froze, listening. At first, there was nothing. Then there it was again, a voice. Faint, but clear enough. My heart pounded in my chest. It wasn't just any voice. It was Riley's. "Harris, I need help," it called, drifting through the trees. It didn't sound right. It was too soft, too distant, like it wasn't really coming from anywhere. I saw the look on Ramirez's face. He was about to bolt, to run into the trees after it. "Stay here," I ordered, my voice more forceful than I meant it to be. But I couldn't let him go. Something in my gut told me that wasn't Riley. Not anymore. The voice called again, closer this time, and Lee was the first to move. "We have to go after him," he snapped, his panic rising. I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "That's not him," I said, but he wasn't listening. His eyes were wide, frantic. "What the hell are you talking about? You heard him." Lee shoved me off and started toward the sound. I shouted his name, but he didn't stop. He disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the darkness, and a minute later, his scream cut through the night. It wasn't a scream of fear. It was agony, pure and sharp, like something had ripped him apart from the inside. Ramirez stood frozen, his knuckles white around his rifle. "We can't stay here," he whispered, his voice barely holding steady. He was right. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to stop until we were all gone. I grabbed Walsh, yanking her away from the radio, and we ran. We left the camp, the fire, everything. Just ran. And the whole time, I could hear Riley's voice, only now it wasn't calling for help. It was laughing. My name is Eric Daniels, Captain, U.S. Air Force. I've led more missions than I can count, from overseas deployments to routine tasks back home. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened at Davis-Monthan. It started as just another assignment. We were sent to the boneyard, that massive graveyard of planes, to retrieve some old equipment. It's where aircraft go to die, lined up in rows under the Arizona sun, their bodies stripped for parts, their history forgotten. I'd been there before, plenty of times, and every time it felt like walking through a museum of ghosts. You see planes that have flown thousands of miles, been through wars, only to end up as rusting carcasses in the desert. The team I had with me was solid. Maintenance guys, mostly, some veterans, some newer recruits. I trusted them. We were supposed to be in and out in a few hours, grab what we needed, load it up, and head back. Nothing out of the ordinary. But from the moment we set foot on that stretch of cracked earth, I could tell something was off. The heat was brutal, sure, but it wasn't just the heat. There was an edge to the place that day, like the planes were watching us. I didn't say anything, but I caught a few of the guys glancing over their shoulders, as if they felt it too. We were about halfway through the task when Sergeant Clark, one of my most reliable men, came up to me. "Sir, you've got to see this," he said, his voice low. There was something in his tone that set me on edge. He led me to a hatch near one of the larger bombers. It was old, rusted, and clearly hadn't been touched in years, maybe decades. "This wasn't on any of the maps," Clark said, wiping sweat from his brow. I stood there, staring at the hatch, feeling my gut twist. Every logical part of my brain told me to leave it alone. We weren't there to explore. We were there to recover equipment, nothing more. But curiosity got the better of me. "Let's check it out," I said, against my better judgment. Clark hesitated for a second, but then nodded, and we pried it open. The air inside was stale, cool. A set of stairs led down into darkness. It didn't make sense. There shouldn't have been anything underground. The base's records were detailed, and there was no mention of tunnels, but the fact that they existed, hidden beneath the graveyard of planes, meant something was deliberately kept off the books. We should have reported it. We should have walked away. But we didn't. We descended. And that's when things started to go wrong. We started down the stairs, one by one, our boots clanging against the metal steps. The light from our flashlights cut through the darkness, casting thin beams on concrete walls that looked like they hadn't seen daylight in decades. I was at the front, leading the way. Clark followed close behind, with a few of the younger guys trailing after. No one spoke. I think we all felt it, this quiet dread settling in as we descended deeper into the unknown. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a narrow corridor. The air was cooler, stale, and smelled faintly of rust and old machinery. The walls were lined with pipes and wires, but everything seemed ancient, untouched for years. I kept expecting to find rats or some sign of life, but there was nothing, just the echo of our footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. "What the hell is this place?" one of the younger guys, Hernandez, muttered from the back. His voice echoed down the hall, making it sound like we weren't alone. Clark knelt down and ran his hand along the wall, squinting at something barely visible in the dim light. "These markings, they're military, but I've never seen anything like this before," he said, his voice tight. I shone my light where he pointed, and sure enough, there were symbols carved into the wall. They looked like old Air Force insignias, but twisted, altered somehow. None of it made any sense. We pressed on. Every few feet, the air seemed to get colder and the walls narrower. The feeling that we shouldn't be there grew stronger with each step, but turning back felt wrong, like we were too far in to stop. I could feel the tension in the team, everyone on edge, waiting for something to happen. It was as if the tunnel itself was watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. We found the first door after what felt like an eternity of walking. It was heavy, made of thick steel, and covered in the same strange markings. There was no lock, but the handle was stiff with age. I hesitated, hand on the knob, and for a second, I thought about calling it off, telling the guys to head back up. But that thought quickly faded. Curiosity, or maybe something else, pushed me forward. I twisted the handle and pulled. The door creaked open, revealing a large room filled with old equipment. Radios, machines I didn't recognize, and a desk piled with yellowing papers. But what caught my eye, what made my heart skip a beat, were the old flight suits hanging along the far wall. 5 of them, all identical, but there was something wrong about the way they hung there. Like they weren't just clothes, like they were waiting for something. For us. "We should go," Thompson said again, his voice trembling more this time. He was right. Every part of me knew we needed to leave, but something kept me rooted. I couldn't tear my eyes away from those suits. I kept thinking about the word in the report, re-engaged. What did that even mean? Were these flight suits from those experiments? Were they the subjects mentioned in the files? The questions gnawed at me, but there was something darker clawing at the edges of my mind. Something I didn't want to say out loud. Clark snapped me out of it. "Daniels, we need to move." His voice was firmer now, trying to get me to snap out of whatever trance I'd fallen into. I nodded, but my body felt slow, like it didn't want to listen. Still, I turned toward the door, stepping back into the hallway with the rest of the team. The second I crossed the threshold, I could feel the weight lift just a little, like we'd escaped something by inches. But then we heard it, a low, creaking sound from behind us. I glanced back, and my blood went cold. One of the flight suits had fallen. It lay crumpled on the floor, like it had been yanked off its hook. For a second, nobody moved. The corridor seemed darker now, like the dim lights above were barely holding on. "What the hell?" Clark whispered. His voice was low, as if speaking too loud might wake something up. Before I could say anything, Hernandez suddenly let out a sharp breath. "Did you guys see that?" He was staring down the hall, past us, deeper into the tunnels. His eyes were wide, full of panic. We turned, following his gaze, but I didn't see anything. Just more of the same, the rusted pipes, the cracked concrete. "See what?" I asked, but I already knew from the look on his face that it wasn't good. There was a figure, standing right there. He pointed, his hand shaking. Looked like one of those pilots, then it just disappeared. Panic hit the team like a wave. Thompson was already backing up, muttering to himself. Clark clenched his jaw, trying to keep it together, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. And as much as I wanted to believe Hernandez had just imagined it, I knew better. I felt it too. Whatever was down here with us, it wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. We stood there in the dim light, trying to make sense of what just happened. Hernandez was still pointing, his hand trembling like he'd seen something impossible. Part of me wanted to tell him to calm down, that it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. We all felt it. The change in the air, the way the shadows seemed thicker now, more alive. Whatever was down here with us wasn't done. "Let's move," I said, my voice steady, though my insides were a mess. "We're getting out of here." I motioned for the others to follow, and we started back the way we came. But each step felt heavier, like something was pulling us deeper instead of letting us leave. The walls felt closer, the tunnel seemed darker, and that nagging feeling in my gut grew stronger. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something behind us, those suits, or worse, whatever Hernandez saw. Thompson was the first to break. "I don't want to die down here," he muttered, his voice cracking. "This place, it's wrong, man. We shouldn't be here." He sped up, practically jogging now, but none of us stopped him. In fact, I wanted to run too. As we neared the stairs, we heard it again, footsteps, but not ours. Slow, deliberate, like someone following us from just out of sight. Clark spun around, shining his light back down the tunnel, but the beam only caught the empty hallway. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. We all heard it. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but when I turned to look again, there was nothing, just the sound of those steps echoing off the concrete, sending chills up my spine. It was like something was toying with us, staying just out of reach. Then they stopped, as suddenly as they had started. The silence after felt heavier than the noise. Thompson bolted for the stairs, and I couldn't blame him. He was halfway up when he screamed. Not a yell of frustration or fear. This was different, raw and panicked. We rushed after him, my heart hammering in my chest, but by the time we reached him, Thompson was on the ground, clutching his leg. His face was pale, his breathing ragged. "Something grabbed me," he gasped, pulled me down. Clark and I exchanged a look, and in that second, I knew it wasn't over. Whatever it wasn't just playing anymore. It was real. It wanted us. I hauled Thompson to his feet, but his eyes were glazed, distant, like he wasn't entirely there. We made it to the top of the stairs, the cold grip of the underground still clinging to us. But as I reached for the door, something clicked in my mind. I turned back, staring down the dark stairwell. It wasn't just that place holding us. We had awakened something. And as I stepped outside into the hot Arizona sun, I could still feel it, that presence. It had followed us out. I'm Captain David Matthews, Special Forces, U.S. Army. I've led missions all over the world, combat zones, recon ops, you name it. Nothing really gets under my skin anymore, or at least that's what I used to believe. But what happened during that night training at Fort Bragg? It changed everything. It was supposed to be routine, just another training exercise. We were dropped off deep in the woods after sundown, tasked with navigating through unfamiliar terrain, avoiding detection, and completing a simulated objective. My team was sharp: Brooks, Jones, Blake, guys I'd trust with my life. The newer recruits, Jacobs and Ramirez, were green but capable. No one was nervous, just focused. We'd done this 100 times before. But as soon as we entered the tree line, something felt off. I could feel it in the air, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I ignored it, thinking it was just the usual nerves before an op. Everyone gets them. Stay tight, stay quiet, I told the team. We moved in a diamond formation, covering our angles, just like we always did. The forest around us was thick, the kind where the trees seemed to swallow up the moonlight. Still, it was just another drill. About an hour in, Jacobs reported hearing something to our left. A branch snapping, maybe, or an animal. "Keep moving," I said. We didn't have time to check every noise, but as we pushed deeper, the sounds kept happening. Branches cracking, rustling behind us, like something was following just out of sight. It wasn't constant, more like brief flashes of movement we couldn't quite catch. My gut told me to stop, to regroup, but there was nothing concrete. I couldn't call it in. I couldn't justify it. Then we lost Jacobs. 1 minute he was there, just behind Brooks, the next, gone. No noise, no sign of struggle, no comms. His radio was dead. I ordered the team to fan out, staying within eyesight, sweeping the area. The search was quick, efficient, but we found nothing. Not a footprint, not a broken branch. Just empty space where he should have been. I tried to stay calm, keep the team focused. "It's got to be a part of the exercise," I said, even though I didn't believe it myself. But the tension was rising, and I could see it in their eyes. The rookies were spooked, and hell, even Brooks looked like he was trying to figure out what was happening. The forest was starting to feel tighter, like it was closing in around us. Something was out there, something we couldn't see, and it was watching. I called for a regroup. We were down a man, and my gut was telling me we weren't dealing with just a standard training mishap. "Fan out, but stay close," I ordered, my voice low. Everyone nodded, but the unease was already thick in the air. I could feel it, like the forest itself was watching. We moved slowly, each of us scanning the area, weapons ready. No one spoke. Even the radio was quiet, which was starting to feel wrong. Brooks was on my left, always reliable, always focused. "You think this is part of the drill?" he asked under his breath, not taking his eyes off the trees. I wanted to tell him yes, that it was all some elaborate setup, but I didn't believe it myself. "We've done enough of these to know when something's not right," I muttered back. His jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything else. We kept moving, pushing forward, hoping we'd find Jacobs or at least some clue as to where he went. That's when I saw it, a shape, maybe 50 yards ahead, slipping between the trees. It was fast, too fast to be one of my guys. I raised my hand to stop the team. "Hold up," I whispered. My heart pounded against my ribs as I strained to see through the darkness. "Brooks, you see that?" He nodded, his eyes locked on the same spot. There was something out there, something big, but it didn't move like a person. "Jones, flank right," I ordered, keeping my voice steady. I didn't want anyone panicking. Jones was already on edge, and I could feel the tension rolling off him. He moved out, taking his position, but his movements were stiff, uncertain. The trees ahead rustled again, and that's when I realized the sound wasn't right. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, like someone or something was watching us, moving just out of sight, like it was toying with us. Suddenly, we heard a crack, loud enough to make everyone stop. It wasn't from the forest. It was behind us. I spun around, my rifle up, ready to engage, but all I saw was Ramirez, standing frozen, his face pale. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I shook my head, trying to keep control. "See what?" He pointed behind him, his hand shaking. "Something's following us. It's been there since we lost Jacobs." I didn't want to admit it, but I knew he wasn't wrong. There was no doubt in my mind now. We weren't alone, and whatever was out here with us, it wasn't playing by the same rules we were. I could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on me, waiting for me to make the call. Ramirez was shaking, still staring at the spot behind us where he swore he saw something. Brooks was steady, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers flexed around his rifle. Jones hadn't moved from his position, his body crouched low, eyes scanning the tree line like he was waiting for something to jump out. I didn't have the luxury of panicking. Not yet. "We need to move," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Whatever's out there, it's trying to mess with us. We stick together, no one breaks formation. We head back to the extraction point, regroup." My words sounded solid, but inside I was just as rattled as the rest of them. We started moving again, but every step felt wrong, like the ground was shifting under us, pulling us in deeper. I kept my focus forward, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, hunted even. And not by anything human. Brooks was on point, leading us through the thick trees, his pace slower than usual. Every few steps, he'd glance over his shoulder, checking on the rest of us, like he didn't trust that we were all still there. I heard the sound again, just a snap, like a branch breaking, but it was close, too close. I signaled for everyone to stop. My heart was pounding, and for a moment I thought I saw movement in the trees. Just a flicker of something, like a shadow slipping between the trunks. I swallowed hard, keeping my rifle raised. "Who's out there?" I called out, even though I already knew no one would answer. Then it happened again. This time, it was Jones. 1 minute he was there, crouched just ahead of me, and the next, he was gone. No sound, no struggle, just gone. My breath caught in my throat as I ran to where he'd been standing. His rifle was still on the ground, dropped like he'd been snatched right out of the air. My stomach twisted, but I couldn't let the others see my fear. Not yet. "Jones!" I shouted, scanning the trees, my voice echoing back at me. Nothing, not even a damn footprint. Brooks came up beside me, his face pale but determined. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice low and steady. He was right. Whatever had taken Jones wasn't done with us yet. We pushed on, the forest growing darker, the air colder. I couldn't shake the thought running through my mind. We were never supposed to come back. Something out here was picking us off, one by one, and I had no idea how to stop it. We kept moving, but every step felt like it was leading us deeper into something we couldn't escape. Brooks was in front, taking the lead, but his usual confidence was gone. His shoulders were tense, his head on a constant swivel. Ramirez stayed close to me, practically glued to my side. The kid was a wreck, and honestly, I couldn't blame him. We'd lost Jacobs and Jones without a trace, and I had no clue what we were up against. All I knew was it wasn't insurgents. This was something else, something we couldn't fight with bullets. "Captain, what the hell is happening?" Ramirez's voice cracked, his fear spilling out. I didn't answer right away because I didn't know how. What was I supposed to say? That I had no idea what was picking us off, that I couldn't even protect my own men. I had to hold it together, for him, for Brooks. "I don't know," I finally said, keeping my voice low. "But we're getting out of here. We stick together, we keep moving, and we'll make it back to base. Understood?" It was more of a command than a reassurance. Ramirez just nodded, his knuckles white around his rifle. I wasn't sure if he believed me. Hell, I wasn't sure if I believed me. The further we went, the thicker the trees became, the branches reaching out like claws. I could feel my skin crawling, the sensation of being watched more intense now. I knew something was out there, but it wasn't just watching, it was hunting. I heard footsteps behind us, faint but steady, like someone was deliberately keeping their distance. Every time I turned around, there was nothing but darkness. "Brooks, stop," I called out, raising my hand. He froze, turning to look at me. His face was pale, his eyes wide with something close to panic. "Do you hear that?" I asked. His eyes darted to the trees behind me, and I could tell he heard it too. The footsteps, the soft crunch of leaves, the feeling that something was right behind us. "We're not alone," Brooks said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's right there, Captain. I swear, it's right there." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Ramirez, get ready," I ordered, but when I looked over at him, his eyes were locked on something behind me. His face drained of color. "Captain," Ramirez whispered, his voice trembling. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. And that's when I saw it. A shape, barely visible in the shadows. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. I couldn't move. The shape in the trees, barely visible, felt like it was staring right through me. Ramirez was frozen next to me, his breathing shallow, eyes wide like he couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. Brooks stepped back, his rifle raised, but his hands were shaking. I wanted to give an order, to do something, but my body wouldn't listen. I'd led men through firefights, ambushes, the worst kind of chaos you can imagine, and yet in that moment, I was paralyzed by something I couldn't even name. The figure shifted, just slightly. It didn't move like a person. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, almost like it was gliding between the trees. My grip tightened around my rifle, but I didn't fire. Something told me that bullets wouldn't do anything. Not against this. I heard Ramirez whisper, "What is that?" But I didn't have an answer. Whatever it wasn't natural. It didn't belong. Then it was gone. Just like that. 1 second it was there, and the next, the space between the trees was empty again. My heart was racing, but the forest was still. Too still. Brooks was the first to speak. "We need to move, now." His voice was strained, barely holding it together. I nodded, forcing myself to take a breath, trying to shove the fear down. We started running. No formation, no plan, just pure, frantic movement. The trees blurred past us, but every time I looked over my shoulder, I expected to see that thing again, sliding through the shadows. The forest seemed endless, like it was growing around us, trapping us in. My legs burned, but the adrenaline kept me going. I heard Ramirez stumble behind me, his breathing ragged. "Don't stop," I shouted, pushing him forward. We broke through into a small clearing, and for a second I thought maybe, just maybe, we'd outrun it. But then Brooks collapsed. He just dropped, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. I ran to him, rolling him onto his back. His eyes were wide open, staring up at the sky, but he wasn't seeing anything. His face was pale, his skin cold. "Brooks!" I shouted, shaking him, but there was nothing. He was gone. No marks, no wounds, just dead. Ramirez backed away, his hands over his mouth, eyes wide with terror. "What the hell, Captain? What's happening?" I didn't have an answer. I couldn't wrap my head around it. 1 minute Brooks was right beside me, and the next he was gone, like something had drained the life out of him without even touching him. I looked down at his body, my mind racing. We hadn't outrun anything. It was still with us, watching. Then I realized the truth. This wasn't an exercise. We weren't supposed to come back. I'm Lieutenant Michael Reynolds. Been in the Navy for a decade now, mostly working on subs. It's what I know best. Tight spaces, metal walls, the hum of the engines. It gets in your bones after a while, but I've always liked it. The submarine is its own world, cut off from everything else. When you're down there, the surface might as well not exist. We were docked at the base in San Diego, running routine maintenance on the Los Angeles-class sub I've spent the last 2 years on. Nothing unusual, nothing special, just checking systems, running diagnostics, making sure everything was in working order. We weren't going anywhere anytime soon, so it was just me and a skeleton crew going through the usual motions. One of the younger guys, Dawson, flagged me down near the command center. "Lieutenant, you need to see this," he said, looking more annoyed than worried. He brought me to one of the security monitors. The feed from one of the lower decks was corrupted, fuzzy, with weird static cutting in and out. I figured it was just another camera issue. These subs are old and things break down. Still, I leaned in, watching the screen closely. For a split second, between the flickers, I thought I saw movement. Just a shadow, quick, gone before I could really process it. "What's the issue?" I asked, pretending not to notice the flicker. I didn't want to seem jumpy. Dawson shrugged. "Just the camera acting up. I'll run a check on it. Probably nothing." He didn't seem concerned, and honestly, neither was I. A broken camera wasn't unusual. I told him to go ahead and run the check, then moved on to the rest of my rounds. But it wasn't just the camera. As the day went on, other small things started happening. The comms system was picking up weird interference, like faint static or sometimes what sounded like whispers. We ran tests, checked the wiring, found nothing wrong. At one point, Chief Taylor, who's been in the Navy longer than I've been alive, caught me in the corridor. "You hearing things too, sir?" he asked, his voice low, like he didn't want anyone else to hear. I nodded, more out of curiosity than concern. It wasn't until we reviewed the audio logs later that night that I realized we weren't dealing with a technical glitch. There was something else, something I couldn't explain. Later that night, after most of the crew had turned in, I sat in the control room with Chief Taylor, going over the audio logs. We'd isolated the interference from the comms, tried to clean it up. At first, it was just static, nothing unusual. But then we heard it, a faint whisper, so quiet you almost wouldn't notice it unless you were really listening. But we were listening. Taylor leaned forward, his face inches from the screen, brow furrowed. "Play that part again," he said. I rewound the audio, played it back. The whisper was clearer this time, but it wasn't words, not any I could recognize. It was more like a breath, barely audible, like someone trying to speak but not quite forming the sounds. Taylor sat back, exhaling through his nose. "You hear that, right?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, feeling that knot of unease in my gut tighten. "Maybe it's interference," I offered, though I didn't believe it. The way the sound came in, sharp, then fading, didn't fit the usual pattern of interference. It was deliberate, like someone was there. I pushed that thought out of my head. Submarines are confined, metal boxes under pressure, sounds bounce, echo, play tricks. We both knew that. But there was something about this that didn't feel right. Taylor glanced at me. "You ever hear anything like that before?" His tone wasn't casual. He'd been in subs longer than anyone on the crew. If he was unsettled, that wasn't a good sign. "No," I admitted. "Not like this." We sat there in the glow of the monitor, neither of us speaking for a long moment. I could hear the faint hum of the sub systems around us, but now it felt different. like the background noise was too loud, like the metal walls were hiding something we couldn't see. Taylor broke the silence first. "We should check that camera again." Reluctantly, I agreed. Dawson had fixed the feed earlier, but now I wanted to see for myself. We pulled up the footage from the lower decks. The screen flickered, then stabilized. Nothing unusual at first, just the usual stillness of an empty submarine. But after a few minutes, something shifted. A shadow. Brief, just out of frame, but enough to make both of us freeze. I played it back, rewound it, zoomed in. But the shadow was gone. I replayed the footage at least a dozen times, hoping to catch something, anything, that could explain what I'd seen. But every time, the same thing. Nothing. Just a flicker of movement, a shadow at the edge of the screen that vanished too quickly to make sense of. Taylor watched me from the corner of the room, arms crossed, that same tight look on his face. Neither of us spoke for a while. It was like we both knew talking about it would make it real, and neither of us wanted to admit what we were thinking. "You know as well as I do that shadows don't just appear out of nowhere," Taylor finally said, his voice low. "Especially not down there." I nodded, still staring at the screen. He was right. The lower decks were mostly sealed off for maintenance. No one should have been down there. I tried to convince myself it was just a glitch, a malfunction in the old camera system. But my gut was telling me something different. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I saw wasn't just a trick of the light. The crew was on edge the next morning. Word travels fast on a submarine, even faster when it's something weird. Hernandez cornered me in the mess hall, his eyes darting nervously. "Sir, Dawson told me about the camera last night. That true? You saw something down there?" I didn't want to fuel the paranoia, but I also didn't want to lie. "Something. Could have been nothing," I said, keeping my voice calm. But Hernandez wasn't buying it. I could see the doubt in his face. Everyone had felt it. This creeping sense that something wasn't right on the sub. It wasn't just the camera feed or the whispers anymore. There was this underlying tension, like the walls themselves were pressing in on us. Later that day, I decided to take a look for myself. I took Taylor with me, more for his calm presence than anything else. We went down to the lower decks, where the flicker had appeared on the footage. The air down there was different, colder somehow. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just the lack of circulation, but I knew better. We walked the length of the corridor, stopping in front of the camera. Everything looked normal. The equipment was in place. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But the longer we stood there, the more it felt like we weren't alone. Taylor stopped, eyes fixed ahead, and I could tell he felt it too. "You hear that?" he asked quietly. I strained to listen. At first, nothing, but then, faintly, like it was coming from the walls themselves, a soft, rhythmic tapping. I froze, my ears straining to make sure it wasn't just the ship settling or my own mind playing tricks. But no, it was real, a slow, deliberate tapping, like something metallic being knocked gently against the hull. Taylor's eyes locked onto mine, both of us thinking the same thing. It shouldn't be happening. Not here. Not this deep inside the sub. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was too focused on the sound, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It wasn't rhythmic like machinery, and it wasn't coming from the pipes. It felt closer. Human almost, if that makes any sense. Like someone or something was trying to get our attention. I motioned for Taylor to follow, and we moved further down the corridor, our footsteps slow, deliberate. The tapping grew louder, then suddenly stopped. We stood there, waiting, but all I could hear now was the blood pounding in my ears. My heart was racing. "Maybe we should check the storage rooms," I muttered, half hoping he'd suggest going back to the control room. But Taylor didn't move. He was staring at something ahead of us, his flashlight beam trained on one of the closed doors. It wasn't the storage room. It was an old hatch that led to a sealed-off compartment, one that hadn't been used in years. The kind of place where no one should be. "I swear I saw something move," Taylor said, his voice shaking now. His composure was cracking, and I didn't like seeing that. The guy was rock solid, always calm under pressure. If he was starting to lose it, that meant things were worse than I thought. I stepped forward, reaching for the hatch. My hand hesitated on the latch. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave it alone, to go back up and pretend none of this was happening. But I couldn't. Not now. I twisted the handle and pulled. The door creaked open, the metal hinges stiff from disuse. A blast of cold air hit me, colder than it had any right to be. My flashlight swept the small, cramped compartment, and for a second, I didn't see anything unusual. Just old equipment, forgotten and covered in dust. But then I saw it, something in the corner, huddled against the wall. A figure, half in shadow, hunched over like it was waiting for us. Taylor let out a sharp breath, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Reynolds, you see that?" I nodded, my throat dry. I didn't want to believe it, but there it was, right in front of us. I stood there, frozen, staring at the figure. At first, it didn't move. It just crouched there, its shape barely distinguishable in the dim light. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't look away. Taylor was still beside me, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He was gripping the flashlight so tightly I could hear the plastic creak under his fingers. I took a slow step forward, my light trained on the figure. "Who's there?" My voice came out harsher than I intended, a mix of fear and anger. It didn't respond, didn't react at all, and that only made it worse. My mind raced through possibilities. Had someone stowed away on the sub? Was this some kind of sick joke? Another step. The beam of my flashlight finally cut through the shadow enough for me to see its face, or what should have been a face. But it wasn't right. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth, just a blank, pale surface like skin stretched over a mask. I stopped dead in my tracks. Every inch of my body screamed to turn around, to get the hell out of there, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at that thing. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Taylor let out a shaky whisper. "Reynolds, what the hell is that?" Before I could answer, the figure shifted. Not like a person moving, but more like it was being pulled by something unseen, its body jerking awkwardly, as if it didn't know how to move. Then, without warning, it stood up, too fast, too fluid. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. It started walking toward us, its movements stiff but deliberate. No sound, no breath, just the creaking of its joints. Taylor grabbed my arm, yanking me back. "We need to go, now." We didn't wait to see what it would do next. We bolted for the corridor, the echo of our footsteps pounding against the metal walls. The thing didn't follow, but I could feel it watching us as we ran, like its gaze was burning into the back of my neck. We reached the upper decks in record time, gasping for air, our nerves completely shot. As we stopped to catch our breath, Taylor looked at me, his face pale. "That wasn't real, right? That couldn't have been real." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew something none of us wanted to admit. Whatever was on that submarine, it wasn't just some figment of our imagination. It was still down there, waiting. And I had the sickening feeling that it wasn't going to stay in the shadows much longer. When I first got the call about the missing kid, I didn't think much of it. Shadows Hills isn't exactly a place where things happen, and most of the time, people turn up after a day or two, hungover or having gotten lost in the woods. But this one felt different. Parents were frantic, and the boy, Kyle, had been gone for over 48 hours. That was enough time to set off some alarm bells. The drive to their house was quiet, too quiet for my liking. Shadows Hills always had this strange atmosphere. I never really gave it much thought before, but lately, things felt off. Like the town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As I pulled up to the house, I could already see Kyle's mom pacing on the porch. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot, and her hands trembling as she clutched her phone like it held some kind of answer. I stepped out of the car, adjusting my belt, and walked up to her, trying to keep my voice calm. "Mrs. Larson, I'm Sheriff Foster. I know this is a difficult time, but I need to ask you some questions about Kyle's last whereabouts." Her eyes darted to the road behind me, as if she expected him to come running home at any second. He was just going for a walk. It's something he always does. He knows these woods like the back of his hand. He wouldn't just... She stopped herself, her voice cracking. He wouldn't just disappear. I've heard it before. People want to believe there's a logical explanation. Maybe they got lost, maybe they ran away. But as she spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play. Shadows Hills had its share of stories. Old folks around here like to talk about the woods like they were alive, hiding secrets that no one should uncover. But I never put stock in any of that. To me, it was just a town with too many trees and not enough sunlight. After talking to Kyle's parents, I decided to take a look around the outskirts of the forest where Kyle was last seen. I'd walked these woods before, but this time felt different. The trees loomed over me like silent witnesses, and every step seemed heavier than the last. My radio crackled, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the stillness, but I ignored it for a moment, listening. For what? I wasn't sure. Maybe it was the nagging thought that something was wrong here, something I couldn't explain. I don't believe in ghosts, never have, but I couldn't deny the feeling that crept up my spine as I moved deeper into the woods. Something wasn't right. I paused for a moment, scanning the tree line, looking for any sign of the boy. A broken branch, a footprint, anything. But there was nothing, just an unsettling sense that I wasn't alone. "Get a grip, Foster," I muttered to myself. But no matter how much I tried to shake it, that feeling stuck with me. I turned back to the trail, the air thick with something I couldn't quite place. I kept walking along the trail, trying to stay focused. My eyes scanned the ground for any sign, but it felt like the woods were playing tricks on me. Every once in a while, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, just a flicker, but when I turned, there was nothing. It was just me, the trees, and that nagging sense that I wasn't as alone as I should be. I radioed back to the station, giving them an update, but my voice felt distant, like I wasn't really sure what I was saying. "Nothing yet. I'll check further down the trail," I said, more to fill the silence than anything else. There was no reason for this tension, no logical explanation. Shadows Hills wasn't the kind of place where strange things happened, but I couldn't shake it. My gut was telling me something was off. The trees seemed to close in as I moved deeper. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe Kyle had wandered off farther than usual. Maybe he ran into some trouble. But why would a kid like him disappear without a trace? No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. It didn't sit right with me. I was about to turn back when I saw something up ahead. Just barely through the trees, something caught the light. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. At first, I thought it might be some old piece of metal, maybe from the old military camp I'd heard about. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't just debris. It was a jacket, torn, dirty, and half buried in the leaves. "Kyle?" I called out, my voice louder than I intended. There was no answer. Of course there wasn't. I crouched down, inspecting the jacket. It was his, no doubt. I recognized the patches his mom had sewn on. A chill crawled up my back, but I forced it down. I needed to think clearly. I picked up the jacket, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It hadn't been here long. The fabric was still dry, which meant it couldn't have been left here more than a day ago. But where the hell was Kyle? I stood up, scanning the area again, more alert now, but still, nothing. That's when I heard it, faint, almost like a whisper, but not quite. My first instinct was to dismiss it. The mind plays tricks when you're in the woods alone, but this was different. It sounded distant, like it was coming from deeper within the trees. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to just turn back and get out of there, but I couldn't leave, knowing Kyle was still missing. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound. Every step made it clearer, like it was guiding me somewhere, pulling me in. But where? And why couldn't I shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one being led down this path? I don't know what kept me moving forward. Every instinct told me to turn back, to leave the jacket there and report it, let the search team handle it. But that sound, faint and strange like something between a voice and an echo, pulled at me. It didn't make sense, but I couldn't ignore it. My grip tightened on the flashlight as I pressed deeper into the woods. The air seemed to change the farther I went, colder somehow, and the trees felt closer. I'd walked this area countless times, but now it felt unfamiliar, foreign. Each step felt heavier, like I was wading through something unseen. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small against the looming trees. No response. But that sound, whatever it was, didn't stop. It grew clearer the closer I got, like a low murmur just out of reach. It wasn't until I saw the clearing ahead that I realized where I was headed. The old military camp. Most of it had rotted away years ago, but there were still a few structures standing, half swallowed by the forest. Nobody came out here anymore. Not willingly, anyway. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing. There it was, the old barracks, or what was left of it, rusted, crumbling, overtaken by vines and rot. It felt wrong being here, like stepping into someone else's nightmare. But something had led me here, and Kyle was still missing. I took a breath, steeling myself, and stepped forward. The ground was uneven, and the weight of the place pressed down on me with every step. "Kyle?" I called again, though I wasn't expecting an answer. But the sound, it was still there, coming from somewhere inside the building. My heart raced as I reached the door, barely hanging on its hinges. I pushed it open, the creak cutting through the stillness like a scream. Inside, it was dark. My flashlight cut a narrow path through the dust and debris, casting long shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I swept the beam across the room, old lockers, rusted beds, the remnants of a place that should have been forgotten. And then I saw it. In the far corner, something moved. A figure, hunched over, barely visible in the weak light. My chest tightened. "Kyle?" I whispered, stepping closer, but the figure didn't react. My heart pounded in my ears as I took another step, my light catching a glimpse of a face, pale, twisted, but not right. Not human. I froze. It didn't make sense. None of this did. But there it was, right in front of me. And before I could move, before I could even process what I was seeing, it turned its head slowly, eyes locked on mine. I stood there, frozen, as the figure in the corner slowly turned its head. I could feel the air in the room grow colder, each breath becoming visible. The creature's face was an eerie mix of familiarity and something completely foreign. It looked almost human, but twisted, distorted in a way that defied logic. I wanted to call out, but my voice felt stuck in my throat. I took a step back, my hand trembling as I fumbled for my radio. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Foster," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need backup at the old military camp. Something's not right." But the radio crackled with static and then went dead. Great. Just perfect timing. The figure rose slowly, its movements jerky, unnatural. It was wearing what looked like an old military uniform, tattered and stained. I tried to tell myself it was just some vagrant who had wandered in, but that thought didn't ease the fear creeping up my spine. This wasn't right. Nothing about this place or the figure felt right. I inched closer, my flashlight beam wavering. The figure's eyes, those eyes, were fixed on me, reflecting a deep, unsettling darkness. I couldn't look away. It was like they were drawing me in, pulling me toward them with an invisible force. "Kyle?" I tried again, desperation in my voice. "Is that you?" No response. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just watched me with those unblinking eyes. I could feel my heart pounding louder, echoing in my ears. I glanced around the room, searching for anything that could help, anything that made sense. But everything seemed to blur together, a jumble of rust and decay. I was about to turn and leave when I noticed something on the floor. A small, worn diary, partially hidden under a pile of debris. My curiosity got the better of me, and I crouched down to pick it up. The cover was almost completely faded, but the pages inside were surprisingly intact. Flipping through them, I saw names, dates, and disturbing sketches of faces twisted in agony. It was a journal from someone who had been here, someone who had witnessed whatever horrors had taken place in this camp. A sudden noise behind me made me jump. I spun around, but the figure was gone. The room was empty. The shadows seemed to close in, and the oppressive silence was almost more unsettling than the sight of the figure. I felt a cold sweat on my brow. "No," I muttered to myself. "This can't be real." I needed to get out of there, but something made me hesitate. The journal in my hand felt heavy, almost as if it was pulling me back. I looked at the door, then back at the diary, torn between fleeing and finding out more. But with each passing second, the sense of dread grew stronger, pushing me towards the edge of my sanity. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Get out," I told myself firmly. "Get out and get help." But as I turned toward the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. And deep down, I knew this was far from over. I stumbled through the door of the old barracks, my flashlight shaking in my grip. The oppressive darkness seemed to swallow everything, leaving only my shallow breaths, and the distant crackle of my dead radio. Each step felt like a step deeper into something I couldn't quite understand. I reached my car and grabbed my gear, trying to calm my racing heart. The journal was still clutched in my hand, its weight dragging me down. I had to get out, get back to town, and report everything. But the nagging feeling that I was missing something crucial refused to leave me. As I drove away from the camp, I glanced at the journal again. The drawings were disturbing. Images of people bound, tortured, their faces contorted in pain. There were also notes about experiments, things that sounded like they were taken straight out of a science fiction novel. The more I read, the more it became clear that something terrible had happened here. But why? What did it have to do with Kyle? Back in town, I went straight to the station. I didn't want to admit how shaken I was, but I knew I had to. I threw the journal on my desk and called a team to gather at the camp. As I started briefing them, I noticed something strange. The names in the diary were familiar. They matched with the names of people who had been reported missing over the years, people who had vanished without a trace. One of the officers, a young guy named Jim, looked at me with wide eyes. "Sheriff, are you telling me this place is connected to those disappearances?" I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the realization hit me. "I think so. But we need to be careful. There's more to this than we thought." As night fell, we headed back to the camp. The old structures seemed even more menacing in the dark. We split up, each team taking different parts of the camp. I found myself drawn back to the barracks, feeling that whatever I needed to understand was still inside. I retraced my steps from earlier, moving cautiously through the debris. I was almost at the spot where I had seen the figure when I heard a faint sound, muffled voices. I followed the sound to a hidden room I hadn't noticed before. The door was barely hanging on its hinges. Inside, I saw something that nearly stopped my heart, a series of old photographs pinned to the wall. They were of the missing people, the ones from the diary. But there was something else in each photo, a shadowy figure standing just out of frame, watching them. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. My flashlight beam swept over the walls, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a folder with documents detailing the experiments conducted at the camp, experiments on fear, on manipulating perception. The chilling truth hit me. The camp wasn't just a place of torture. It was a place where they experimented on making people see things that weren't there, pushing them to their limits. As I realized the full scope of the horror, the figure I had seen earlier reappeared in the doorway, its twisted face a grotesque mockery of humanity. The realization hit me with full force. This was no longer just about Kyle. The camp had turned into a nightmare machine, preying on the deepest fears of those who ventured too close. I ran out of the room, the weight of the journal and the documents almost unbearable. The more I learned, the more I understood the true depth of the terror hidden in Shadow's Hills. I had to leave, had to get this information out. But as I drove away, the feeling of being watched never left me. I couldn't shake the sense that the camp wasn't just a place of horrors, but a gateway to something far worse. The fear I felt was real, and as much as I wanted to believe I'd escaped, I knew the true nightmare had only just begun. We'd been stationed at Edwards Air Force Base for a few months when the call came in about Hangar 13. It was the kind of assignment that felt more like punishment than responsibility, cleaning up an old hangar that hadn't seen daylight in decades. My team, though, we were used to the strange. But when we walked into that hangar for the first time, there was something about it that gnawed at the edges of my mind, like an itch I couldn't scratch. It wasn't the dust or the creaking metal, either. It was something deeper. I didn't voice it right away. It felt silly. I chalked it up to the isolation of the place, but there was a part of me that wondered if maybe I should have trusted that instinct. As we entered, I glanced at the others. Rick, one of the engineers, was already complaining about the state of the equipment. "This stuff's ancient, Captain. It'll take weeks just to make it operational again." His voice bounced off the walls, as if the space itself was hungry for sound. I stayed quiet, just nodding. My attention was pulled toward a row of covered crates in the far corner. Old, unmarked. I made a mental note to check them out later. We spent most of that first day setting up, trying to clear space around the hangar. The air felt stale, thick in a way that made breathing just a little too noticeable. "It's like this place has been sealed off from the world," Jackson, our comms guy, muttered. I laughed it off, but my fingers twitched at the edge of my sleeve. It wasn't a funny comment. That night, after hours of clearing old boxes and broken down machinery, we found something. Files. Thick, dusty manila folders that were hidden beneath a pile of metal parts in the back. Rick whistled low, holding one up to the light. What the hell did we just stumble onto? I could feel something shift in the room when we opened the first folder. Black and white photos, old schematics, notes scribbled in the margins. Experimental technology dated back to the 1960s. There was something off about the photos, though. People in them looked scared, like they weren't supposed to be there. One picture in particular stuck with me, a man standing in front of some kind of large machine. His expression, I don't know how to describe it. It was like he knew something was about to go terribly wrong. I should have called it then, should have packed everything up and handed it off to command. But curiosity got the better of me. It always does. So we stayed late that night, combing through the files, piecing together the story of what had happened in Hangar 13 all those years ago. That's when the lights started flickering. The lights flickered once, twice, and then stayed off for what felt like forever. The hum of the machinery we'd been working on just cut out, leaving a strange emptiness in the air. My eyes strained in the sudden darkness. "Rick," I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. There was no answer at first, just the sound of our breaths, quick and shallow. I heard Jackson shuffle next to me, muttering something under his breath, probably trying to make sense of it. "Power's been weird in this place," he said, his tone forced casual, but I wasn't buying it. None of us were. I reached for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows like it was hunting for something. For a second, I thought I saw movement by the crates, just a flicker of motion in the corner of my eye. But when I pointed the light over there, it was just the same pile of equipment, old and untouched. "It's nothing," I told myself, "just nerves." Rick finally responded, his voice distant. "I'll check the breakers. Might be something simple." I didn't like how small his voice sounded in that big hangar. It was like the space was swallowing him up. He walked off into the dark, and the sound of his boots echoed around us before fading completely. I stood there, gripping the flashlight, waiting for the familiar buzz of electricity to return, but it didn't. That cold, suffocating stillness settled back in. As the minutes passed, something felt wrong. It wasn't just the dark or the fact that Rick hadn't come back. It was more primal than that, like the hangar itself was watching us. I shook the thought off, but my heart wouldn't slow down. "Emily, you're losing it," I whispered to myself. But I knew I wasn't. Something about this place wasn't right, and it had been like that since we walked in. Jackson, always the skeptic, broke the silence. "Probably just old wiring. This place hasn't been used in years, bound to be a few glitches." He was trying to calm both of us, but his voice trembled just enough that I caught it. He felt it too, whatever it was. Another flicker of movement caught my eye, but this time it wasn't just my imagination. I swear I saw something shift near the back of the hangar, a shadow that wasn't supposed to be there. I turned the flashlight in that direction again, and the beam landed on the old crates we'd uncovered earlier. My breath hitched. The tarp covering one of the crates had moved. It was subtle, like a breeze had lifted it for a second. Only there was no breeze. We were sealed in. I didn't say anything, didn't want to sound paranoid, but I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned to Jackson, but his eyes were locked on the same spot. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper now. He didn't answer, just nodded slowly. Jackson's nod confirmed it. I wasn't seeing things. My mind raced through all the logical explanations I could muster. Maybe an animal had gotten in. Maybe the tarp just settled on its own. But neither of those made sense. We'd sealed the hangar tight when we came in, and the air in here felt stale, undisturbed. No breeze, no rodents, nothing that could explain the slow, deliberate way that tarp had shifted. "Let's check it out," Jackson muttered, but his voice didn't carry the confidence he was trying to project. My stomach tightened as I pointed the flashlight at the tarp again, my hand shaking just enough that the beam wavered over the crate. I didn't want to move forward. Every instinct in my body screamed to stay put, but my feet betrayed me, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the thing I wanted most to avoid. What if it's just Rick messing with us? I tried to joke, my voice hollow, hoping to break the tension. But even I didn't believe it. Rick wasn't the type to play games, especially not in this place. I glanced over my shoulder at Jackson. His face was pale, eyes locked on the tarp, lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't buying my attempt at humor either. As we got closer, the tarp shifted again, but this time it was more than a twitch. It lifted, like something was underneath it, pushing against the fabric. My breath caught in my throat. For a split second, I was frozen, waiting for something to emerge, something that I couldn't even begin to imagine. The light from my flashlight flickered across the edge of the crate, casting long, jagged shadows on the wall behind us. "What the hell is under there?" Jackson whispered, barely audible, like he didn't want to say it too loud, in case whatever it was might hear us. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was cycling through images, half-formed thoughts of what might be under that tarp, none of them good. My pulse pounded in my ears as I reached out, fingers trembling, ready to grab the corner of the tarp and yank it away. But before I could, something moved again, fast, deliberate, and the tarp snapped back, falling flat against the crate. Jackson let out a choked gasp. I jumped back, my flashlight flicking up to the ceiling, searching for what? I didn't even know. But the crate was still, as if nothing had happened. Just a dusty box, sitting there like it had been for decades. "Emily?" Jackson's voice cracked, and I could hear the rising panic in it now. My own heart hammered in response, but I forced myself to keep it together. We had to stay rational. We had to. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed from the far end of the hangar. My flashlight snapped toward the noise, and in the beam I saw Rick. At least I thought it was Rick. But something wasn't right. He was standing too still, just out of reach of the light, like he was waiting for something. Rick stood there, not moving, not even blinking. My flashlight wavered, casting long, dancing shadows across his face. The stillness of his posture made my skin crawl. He was too close to the shadows, too close to something we couldn't see clearly. I called out to him, "Rick, are you okay? What are you doing?" He didn't respond. It was as if he was frozen, or maybe he was just waiting for us to come closer. Jackson shifted uneasily next to me, his grip on his flashlight tightening. I could hear his breathing, sharp and rapid. "Rick, this isn't funny anymore," Jackson said, his voice trembling. "If this is a prank, you've gone too far." Still no reaction from Rick. I took a cautious step forward, my eyes locked on him. The closer I got, the more I felt an odd pull in my chest. It was like an unseen force was dragging me toward him. My hands felt cold, and my heartbeat seemed to sync with the shuffling noise coming from the end of the hangar. I hesitated, wondering if I should turn back, but curiosity, or perhaps a strange compulsion, drove me forward. "Rick," I called again, this time more forcefully. I reached out, my fingers brushing against his shoulder. His skin felt unnervingly cold, like touching a block of ice. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look at me. A chill swept through me as I noticed something else. His eyes, when I managed to get a glimpse of them, were clouded and unfocused. There was no recognition in them, just a vacant stare. "Rick, are you with us?" I asked, trying to shake him gently. His head lolled slightly, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear, maybe? Or was it something darker? Jackson was now beside me, his own flashlight illuminating Rick's face. The tension between us was palpable. "We need to get him out of here," Jackson whispered, his voice cracking. I was about to pull Rick away when the hangar seemed to exhale. The whole place shuddered, and a low, resonant hum began, like a gigantic machine coming to life. The sound grew louder, vibrating through my bones, and the walls seemed to shift and swell. I could barely hear Jackson's panicked voice over the noise. "Emily, what's happening?" I couldn't answer. The hangar was closing in on us, warping reality around us. Rick remained motionless, his eyes still vacant. I struggled to breathe, trying to focus on getting him out. But as I turned to call for help, the hangar's walls seemed to blur, distorting everything around us. The humming grew unbearable, and I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. A sudden crash echoed from somewhere deeper in the hangar, making me jump. The sound of shifting metal and grinding gears was deafening. I grabbed Rick's arm and yanked him toward the exit, but the way forward seemed to twist and elongate, like we were walking through a maze that kept changing. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of this nightmarish place. But the hangar seemed to conspire against us, pulling us deeper into its malevolent grasp. Each step felt like a battle, and my mind raced with the realization that this hangar might be more than just a storage facility. It might be something alive, something that fed on our fears and doubts. The longer we stumbled through the twisting corridors of Hangar 13, the more disoriented I felt. The once familiar space seemed to mock us, shifting and warping with each step. I tried to focus on Rick, who was still unresponsive, his eyes glazed over as if they were trapped in some terrible dream. Jackson's breathing was frantic next to me, his flashlight casting wild shadows that danced along the walls, making everything look even more surreal. "Emily, this isn't right," Jackson gasped. "We need to get out of here now." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I could trust my own senses. The hum that had started earlier had now turned into a deep, resonant growl. It felt as if the entire hangar was alive, breathing and pulsing with a malevolent energy. My flashlight flickered, and the beam seemed to struggle against the encroaching darkness. We finally reached what we thought was an exit, only to find it blocked by a massive, rusted door that groaned and shuddered as we pushed against it. Panic set in. I banged on the door, yelling for help, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive noise around us. My hands were raw and shaking as I slammed into the door with all my might. Then, something even more unsettling happened. The door started to tremble violently. I stepped back, my heart racing as the door slowly began to open, not outward but inward, as if being pulled by an unseen force. As the gap widened, I could see what was on the other side, a room filled with old equipment and dusty files. The room seemed to be moving, though it was hard to tell if it was the hangar itself or my own mind playing tricks. "Emily, look," Jackson pointed toward the files, which were eerily glowing with an unnatural light. "There's something wrong with those documents." I approached cautiously, my curiosity overcoming my fear. I picked up one of the files. The label read Project Midnight, and as I opened it, the contents made my blood run cold. The pages were filled with bizarre experiments and disturbing reports from the Cold War era, experiments on psychological manipulation and fear induction. Jackson peered over my shoulder, his face pale. "Is this what we've been dealing with? Some kind of psychological experiment?" Before I could answer, the growl from the hangar intensified. It felt like the walls were closing in on us. I turned to find Rick finally moving, but not in a way that was reassuring. He was walking toward the glowing room with an unsteady gait, as if guided by an invisible hand. "Rick, no!" I shouted, but he didn't react. He was drawn to the center of the room, where an old, dusty chair sat ominously. He seemed to sink into it, his eyes locking onto a peculiar machine in the corner that emitted a low, pulsating light. Jackson and I exchanged a worried glance. The growling had become almost deafening, and the air around us seemed to thicken. I moved closer to Rick, desperate to pull him out of the chair, but an invisible force seemed to hold me back. I felt an icy grip around my chest, as if the hangar itself was trying to keep me away. The machine in the corner began to whir, and strange images flickered on its screen. Images of past experiments, fear-filled faces, and horrifying scenes. It was like watching a nightmare unfold in real time. The room began to distort again, and the growl grew louder until it felt like it was coming from inside my head. Suddenly, everything stopped. The growl ceased, the hangar's walls stopped shifting, and the machine powered down. Rick slumped forward, his eyes returning to their normal state. He looked around, bewildered, as if waking from a deep trance. Jackson and I were left breathless, our hearts pounding in our chests. I turned to Jackson, my mind racing. What just happened? What did we uncover? Jackson's face was ashen. I think we've been trapped in some kind of psychological experiment. This hangar, these files, they're not just old technology. They're part of something much more sinister." I glanced back at Rick, who was slowly regaining his composure. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. before whatever this place is decides it's not done with us yet. As we stumbled out of the hangar, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift, but the sense of dread remained. The hangar might have let us leave, but the unsettling feeling that something more malevolent was lurking beneath the surface stayed with us. The truth about Hangar 13 had only just begun to unfold, and I couldn't shake the fear that we hadn't seen the last of its dark secrets. When we were sent to Camp Pendleton for what was supposed to be a routine survival exercise, I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. The plan was simple: spend a week in an isolated area of the base, practice our survival skills, and return. But as soon as we arrived, something felt off. Maybe it was the sheer emptiness of the place, or the way the dense forest seemed to swallow every sound we made. We set up camp at the edge of a remote training area, surrounded by nothing but trees and rugged terrain. Sergeant Clark, our leader, was as professional as ever. "Let's get this done efficiently and get back," he said. But there was a slight edge in his voice, a hint of unease. We joked about it, how he was always so serious about these exercises. Yet the laughter felt forced. As the sun began to set, the darkness seemed to close in around us. It was more than just the absence of light. It was like something tangible was pressing in. We went over our plan for the next day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "You okay?" asked Thompson, one of the newer guys, as he caught me staring off into the trees. "Yeah, just something feels weird," I replied, brushing it off. That night, as we settled into our tents, I could hear faint noises outside. At first, it was just the wind rustling through the trees. But then, there were footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing around our camp. I checked my watch. It was just past midnight. I told myself it was nothing, maybe an animal, or just my imagination getting the better of me. The next morning, things seemed normal at first. We conducted our drills and went over our survival tactics. Yet, every now and then, I noticed odd details. A piece of equipment slightly out of place, a mark on a tree that hadn't been there before. It was small stuff, but in the context of our isolation, it felt unsettling. "Is it just me, or is something off?" I asked Clark, who merely shrugged. "It's probably just nerves. Let's stay focused." We attempted to make radio contact with the base for our routine check-in. The response we received was garbled and incomprehensible. "We're experiencing some technical difficulties," the voice crackled, but it didn't sound right. Something about the tone felt artificial. We tried again, but the results were the same. I couldn't help but feel that we were being deliberately kept in the dark. As the day wore on, the sense of isolation grew stronger. The forest around us seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and every sound was amplified. It wasn't just the remoteness, it was a palpable, almost malevolent presence. I began to doubt if we were alone out here, or if something else was lurking, waiting. By the second day, things started to deteriorate rapidly. The initial unease had transformed into a constant, gnawing anxiety. During our morning briefing, Clark's usual confidence had vanished. His eyes were sharper, darting around as if searching for something unseen. "We need to keep our heads in the game," he said, though his voice betrayed his own tension. We continued with our drills, but the small issues began to pile up. Equipment malfunctioned for no apparent reason, and our radio checks became increasingly frustrating. The static was unnerving, but what bothered me more was the odd, almost rhythmic pattern that seemed to pulse through the interference. It was like someone, or something, was trying to communicate through the noise. "Clark, something's not right with the radios," I mentioned during a break, hoping he'd have an explanation. He looked at me with a tight smile. "I've noticed. We're probably just dealing with some technical glitches. Let's stay sharp." His reassurances did little to ease the growing sense of dread. As night fell, the forest seemed to come alive in ways I couldn't explain. Shadows danced just beyond the edge of our camp, and every creak of the trees sounded like footsteps. I tried to focus on our tasks, but my mind kept drifting back to those unsettling noises. "It's all in your head," I muttered to myself, but the words offered no comfort. The next attempt to communicate with the base yielded more garbled responses. We were told to expect delays and to hold tight. It wasn't just the distorted messages that were troubling. It was the way they seemed to come from somewhere else, like the voice was being played through a broken speaker. "Clark, I think someone's messing with us," I said, my voice betraying my fear. "We're not getting anything coherent." Clark's response was curt. "We're here for a reason. If something's wrong, we'll deal with it. Just keep your focus." But his reassurance was hollow. The sense of being cut off from the outside world was unsettling. We were supposed to be isolated, but this felt different, more like we were being deliberately isolated. As the days passed, the feeling of paranoia intensified. We started seeing glimpses of movement in the trees, just fleeting shadows, but they were enough to make us jump. I found myself questioning every sound, every rustle in the bushes. Was it an animal, or was something out there watching us? The atmosphere was thick with tension, and it felt like our own fears were feeding off each other. Every creak of the tent, every snap of a twig made me jump. I tried to stay calm, but the sense that something was wrong grew stronger with each passing hour. It was as if the forest was alive, and it was working against us. By the fourth day, the atmosphere had shifted from uneasy to downright eerie. Our attempts to reach the base were met with increasingly bizarre responses. The radio messages were no longer just garbled. They were distorted, twisted, and peppered with what sounded like coded static. It was as if someone, or something, was deliberately tampering with our communication. During one of our patrols, Sergeant Clark and I stumbled upon something unsettling. We'd been scanning the perimeter when I noticed something odd in the underbrush. A series of strange markings were etched into the dirt, symbols I'd never seen before. They were crude, yet somehow deliberate, and they sent a chill down my spine. I showed them to Clark, who frowned at the sight. "Could be a prank," he suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Let's keep moving." But it didn't feel like a prank. The markings seemed too deliberate, too intentional. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. What kind of prank involved cryptic symbols in the middle of nowhere? As night fell, the sense of dread grew. The sounds of the forest, once a background hum, now seemed to pulse with a menacing energy. I lay in my tent, trying to ignore the constant rustling outside. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind, felt charged with a strange and palpable sense of hostility. I tried to convince myself it was just the forest settling, but my anxiety made it hard to focus. Clark called an emergency meeting that evening. He was more agitated than I'd ever seen him, his face drawn and tired. "We need to figure out what's going on," he said, his voice edged with frustration. "Something is seriously off. The radio interference isn't just a glitch." "What do you suggest we do?" I asked, trying to hide my own fear behind a facade of professionalism. "We need to get a better signal," he replied. "We'll try a different frequency and see if that clears things up." We set up the new equipment, and as we worked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I couldn't shake the sensation that eyes were on us, even though the darkness was impenetrable. The whispers of the forest seemed to grow louder, not in volume, but in urgency. It felt like the trees themselves were closing in, pressing against our sanity. Just as I was about to finish setting up the radio, I heard a voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakably clear. "Help us." The voice was distorted, and it came through the static like a ghost from another world. I looked at Clark, who was staring at the radio in disbelief. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He nodded, his expression pale. "Yeah, we need to get out of here." But leaving wasn't as simple as it seemed. The forest now felt like a maze with no exit, and our sense of direction was failing us. As we navigated through the darkness, it became evident that something was manipulating our perception. We'd turn a corner, only to find ourselves back where we started. It was as if the forest was playing tricks on us, feeding off our fear and confusion. We were trapped, and it was becoming increasingly clear that whatever was out there was not only toying with us, but also controlling our minds. By the fifth day, the forest had become an endless, twisted maze. Every direction we turned, every path we followed, led us back to the same disorienting spot. It was like we were walking in circles, with the same twisted trees and dense underbrush mocking our attempts to escape. The disorientation wasn't just physical, it was creeping into our minds. I could see the strain on my team. Lieutenant Harris's face was pale, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "We're being messed with," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. His voice trembled as if he was holding back a scream. "This isn't right. It's like we're stuck in a nightmare." We were desperate for answers, but each step forward seemed to trap us further. As night fell again, the forest grew darker, and the air felt thick with an invisible pressure. Our equipment continued to malfunction, and every time we tried to get a signal, we were met with strange, garbled messages. There were moments when we heard voices again, but they were distorted and fragmented. One message came through clear enough to make my blood run cold. "You're not alone." Clark called us together for what felt like the 100th briefing. "We need to stay calm," he said, though his voice was tight. "We need to focus on finding a way out and not letting this place get inside our heads." I nodded, but the words felt hollow. My own mind was starting to unravel. Every rustle, every snap of a twig seemed to pulse with malice. Even the shadows appeared to move with a deliberate, mocking rhythm. I tried to reason with myself. This was just the stress and exhaustion, nothing more. But deep down, I knew that wasn't entirely true. I was on guard duty that night, my nerves stretched thin. I kept seeing figures darting between the trees, fleeting glimpses that vanished whenever I looked directly. The static on the radio grew more oppressive, filling my head with a constant, maddening hiss. I could feel my sanity slipping, and I was terrified of what might happen next. Around midnight, things took a darker turn. I heard a loud crash from the direction of our camp. Rushing back, I found Harris standing in the middle of the campsite, staring at something I couldn't see. His face was a mask of terror, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. "I saw something," he said, his voice barely audible. "Something. Not human." Clark and I tried to calm him, but his description was incoherent. As we tried to get him settled, I noticed something disturbing. Our radio equipment had been tampered with. The wires were frayed, and the connections were loose. It was as if someone, or something, had deliberately sabotaged our means of communication. We were trapped, both physically and mentally. The forest wasn't just a maze. It was a trap designed to play on our deepest fears. Every shadow seemed to whisper our darkest secrets. Every sound seemed to taunt us. The psychological pressure was mounting, and I wasn't sure how much longer we could hold on. The line between reality and hallucination was blurring. As I lay in my tent, trying to ignore the pounding of my heart, I knew one thing for certain. We had to find a way out before this place broke us completely. The forest was closing in, and our minds were the battleground. We had to escape before it consumed us entirely. By the 6th day, we were barely functioning. Exhaustion clawed at us, and the forest seemed to mock our every move. Our efforts to contact base failed, and the sense of isolation grew thicker. We were trapped in our own nightmares, each member of the team showing signs of severe psychological strain. It felt like the forest had taken on a malevolent intelligence, a predator playing with its prey. That night, we decided to regroup and try one last attempt to find a way out. Clark seemed desperate, his usual calm demeanor replaced by an edge of panic. "We need to figure out what's really going on here," he said, his voice quivering. "Something's manipulating us. We're not just lost." The idea gnawed at me, but we had no choice but to press on. I joined Harris and a few others in searching for any sign of a way out. We stumbled through the dark, the weight of fatigue making every step a struggle. It was then that we found something unsettling, a crude, makeshift device buried in the undergrowth. It looked like a home-built signal jammer, and it was still active. "Who the hell would set this up here?" Harris asked, his voice filled with disbelief. The realization that our signals were being intercepted wasn't just unsettling, it was infuriating. Someone was toying with us, and that someone was using our own fears against us. We continued our search, but our sense of direction was completely gone. The forest seemed to shift around us, with trees appearing where they hadn't been before. At this point, every shadow seemed to carry a threat, and every sound felt deliberately orchestrated to unsettle us. In the midst of this chaos, Clark made a chilling discovery. He found a hidden bunker, almost buried in the ground. Inside, there were old surveillance equipment and records of our communications. It was clear that someone had been watching us the entire time. My heart raced as I read through the logs, notes about our reactions, observations about our fears. It was like someone had been studying us, learning how to break us down. It dawned on me then. The real horror wasn't just the isolation or the constant feeling of being watched. It was the knowledge that someone was using our fears against us, manipulating us like puppets. We weren't just lost. We were part of a twisted experiment. My mind raced as I tried to piece together what was happening. Was there someone else in the forest with us? Or were we simply victims of an elaborate psychological trap? As we confronted Clark about the bunker, he broke down. "I thought I was protecting you all," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I knew something was wrong, but I didn't realize they were using us like this." The revelation shattered the little sanity we had left. Our trust in each other eroded as we realized the true extent of our situation. The forest wasn't just a place of isolation, it was a stage for someone's cruel game. The oppressive feeling that had been hanging over us was no longer just paranoia. It was a deliberate creation. We had to escape, but I wasn't sure if we could. The forest seemed to close in on us with every step, its shadows growing darker, its whispers more insidious. As we tried to navigate back to the base, the terror of what we had learned began to settle in. The line between reality and madness had been obliterated, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were only beginning to understand the true horror of our situation. The day began like any other at West Point, with a brisk morning and the usual routine of cadets and staff going about their business. I'm Captain Laura Thompson, and today I was tasked with giving a lecture on historical documents, a subject I usually find rather mundane. I was leading a group of cadets through the dusty old archives, explaining the importance of preserving military history. Little did I know that this ordinary day would turn into something I'd never forget. As we entered the rarely accessed section of the library, I noticed a certain heaviness in the air, though I couldn't quite place it. The room was filled with old filing cabinets and shelves crammed with yellowing papers. I began pointing out various records when one of the cadets, a sharp-eyed young woman named Emily, pulled out a file that seemed older and more worn than the rest. The label was barely legible, but it mentioned something about psychological experiments. My curiosity was piqued, and I signaled Emily to open it. The documents inside were filled with detailed notes on experiments conducted in the 1960s and 1970s. They described methods like sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and other psychological techniques. It was clear these experiments were designed to push human endurance to its limits. My initial reaction was a mix of intrigue and skepticism. Such methods seemed outdated, almost barbaric compared to today's standards. The cadets were equally fascinated. "Captain, do you think these experiments were really conducted here?" asked Michael, one of the more inquisitive cadets. I glanced at the documents again, noting the eerie precision of the descriptions. "It looks like they were," I replied, "but we should be careful. Historical records can sometimes be misleading or exaggerated." As the cadets dug deeper into the files, a strange chill began to settle over the room. The air felt oddly thick, and I noticed a few of the cadets shifting uneasily. I tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to the old, musty environment. Yet, something about the way the files described the experiments, especially the parts about psychological control, left me feeling uneasy. The session ended with the cadets more excited than ever. They were eager to investigate further, but I was troubled by the implications of what we had found. That night, as I reviewed the documents in my office, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The pages of the files seemed to shift as if whispering secrets just out of reach. I tried to convince myself it was just the weight of the day catching up with me. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the growing sense that we had uncovered something unsettling. Tomorrow, we'll begin a more thorough investigation of the documents, but a part of me wishes we had left them undisturbed. The feeling of being watched, the strange tension that settled over us, these were not things I could easily dismiss. And as the shadows lengthen outside my window, I find myself wondering what other secrets lie buried within these old files. The following morning, the cadets and I reconvened to continue our exploration of the files. I tried to ignore the unease from last night, focusing on the task at hand. We assembled in the archive room, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The room seemed darker, though the lights were the same as before. Emily was flipping through a particularly worn file, her brow furrowed. "Captain, this document describes a subject's experience of altered reality. It's almost as if the experimenters were trying to make them question what was real." Her voice had an edge of disbelief, but also a hint of fascination. I glanced at the document she was holding. The language was clinical, but the implications were deeply disturbing. I nodded, trying to keep my composure. These kinds of experiments were controversial even back then. It's possible they were trying to push the boundaries of psychological resilience. But as I spoke, I noticed Michael pacing near a row of filing cabinets. He seemed more agitated than the others. "Captain," Michael said, stopping abruptly. "There's something off about these documents. Look at this." He held up a folder with several pages missing, their edges ragged as if torn out hastily. "It looks like someone's been tampering with them." The room grew colder as I examined the folder. The missing pages hinted at secrets deliberately hidden. A knot tightened in my stomach. "Let's not jump to conclusions. We need to be cautious," I said, though my own words did little to reassure me. As the day wore on, I couldn't ignore the sense of being observed. It wasn't just the cadets, though their anxiety was palpable. I felt it myself, like a shadow just beyond my peripheral vision. I dismissed it as stress, but when I was alone, I heard faint noises, a rustling of paper or a soft creak from the direction of the archives. Each sound set my nerves on edge. That evening, I stayed behind to review more documents. The light from my desk lamp cast long shadows across the walls, making the room seem even more foreboding. My mind kept replaying the eerie details of the experiments, the way they described inducing fear and paranoia. What had been done here? And why did it feel like something was still lingering, waiting? The more I read, the more I felt that our investigation was unearthing something that wasn't meant to be discovered. A gnawing fear took hold. What if the experiments had left behind more than just historical records? What if they had a lasting impact on the Academy itself? I needed answers, but each page turned only deepened the mystery. And with every passing hour, the sense of dread grew stronger, as if something was waiting for us to uncover the truth. The next few days were a blur of disjointed thoughts and growing unease. Each time I walked through the archives, it felt as though I was being watched. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was moving in the corners of my vision, only to disappear when I turned my head. One night, as I was reviewing the remaining files, Emily burst in, her face pale. "Captain, you need to see this." Her voice was barely above a whisper. She handed me a document marked with an ominous red stamp, "Top Secret." I scanned through it, and the details were chilling. Records of psychological manipulations that went far beyond simple experiments. They were designed to break a person's will, to make them see things that weren't there, feel things that weren't happening. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "This isn't just historical data. It's as if they were trying to create a living nightmare." Emily's hands trembled as she pointed to a section describing sensory deprivation experiments. They made subjects experience hallucinations. They wanted to see how far they could push the human mind. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. This explains the weird occurrences. If these methods were used, they could have left lasting effects. The realization hit me hard. What if the Academy itself had become a part of the experiment? What if the manipulations had seeped into our present reality? Later that night, Michael and I decided to investigate the building's older sections, hoping to find clues about the lingering presence. The deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. The dimly lit hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, and the shadows on the walls seemed to writhe. Every creak of the floorboards felt like an echo of the past, as if the walls themselves were whispering forgotten secrets. Suddenly, Michael stopped. "Captain, do you hear that?" It was faint, like a distant murmur. We followed the sound to a locked door at the end of a dark corridor. The door had a rusty, old-fashioned lock that looked out of place compared to the rest of the Academy's modern security. "We need to find out what's behind this door," I said, my voice low. We pried it open with difficulty. Inside, the room was filled with old equipment, charts, and strange devices I'd never seen before. The air felt dense, heavy with a history of experimentation. As I examined a set of files on a dusty table, I felt a sudden chill. The hairs on my neck stood up, and I turned to see Michael staring at something behind me. "Captain, look!" His voice was shaky. I followed his gaze to a corner of the room where a figure seemed to materialize, a shadowy outline that looked vaguely human but moved unnaturally, as though its form was glitching in and out of reality. My heart pounded as the figure slowly approached us, its movements jerky and erratic. The figure vanished as abruptly as it appeared, leaving only the cold, oppressive feeling in the room. We quickly left, both shaken. Back in our quarters, I tried to make sense of what we'd seen. The documents, the equipment, the apparition, it all pointed to something deeply disturbing. The Academy's walls seemed to hold secrets that were never meant to be uncovered, and every step we took brought us closer to a truth that might be better left unknown. We returned to the archives the next morning, our minds still reeling from the previous night. Every creak of the old floorboards seemed to echo louder than usual. I glanced at Emily and Michael. They were visibly shaken, their faces pale and eyes weary. "Look, we need to figure this out," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "We can't ignore what we saw." As we went through the documents again, a sense of dread settled over me. The room felt colder, the shadows longer. I opened a file detailing the results of the experiments. Each word seemed to crawl off the page with a menacing tone. The experiments described were more disturbing than I had imagined. They weren't just about mental manipulation. They were about creating an environment where fear and paranoia could thrive. Emily pulled me aside. "Captain, I've been feeling something. It's like I'm being watched. I can't shake it. It's creeping into my dreams." I looked at her, concern etched on my face. "I know what you mean. It's like the walls are closing in. We need to stay focused, but I can't deny it's affecting us." Michael joined us, his voice unsteady. "It's not just us. I've talked to some of the cadets. They're feeling it too. Something's not right." We decided to confront the head archivist, hoping to get more information about the files we'd uncovered. The archivist's office was located in a different part of the academy, away from the archives. As we walked through the long corridors, the sense of being watched intensified. Every shadow seemed to twist unnaturally. Every sound felt amplified. The archivist, Dr. Hayes, was a stern-looking man in his late 60s. When we mentioned the experiments, his face went ashen. "You shouldn't have seen those files," he said abruptly. "They were sealed for a reason." I pressed him. "What exactly were they doing? Why is it still affecting us?" Dr. Hayes hesitated, then lowered his voice. "The experiments were designed to study the limits of human perception and control. They used the academy as a testing ground, manipulating the environment to induce extreme psychological states. They never intended for the results to be public. The residual effects, they linger." The room felt suddenly colder, and I noticed Dr. Hayes' hands shaking slightly. "Residual effects?" I asked. "You mean to tell me that what we're experiencing is part of the experiment?" Dr. Hayes nodded. "Yes, the experiments left an imprint. It's why the academy feels different. It's why you're seeing things." We left his office, the gravity of his words sinking in. As we walked back, the sense of dread grew stronger. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. Michael's footsteps echoed loudly, a stark reminder of our isolation. That night, as I tried to sleep, my mind was consumed by what Dr. Hayes had revealed. The walls of my quarters seemed to close in, and every sound was amplified. I tried to calm my racing thoughts, but sleep eluded me. I knew we were approaching the heart of the darkness that had taken hold of West Point, and I feared what we would find. As the days went on, the effects of the experiments seemed to escalate. The cadets became increasingly anxious, and strange occurrences became more frequent. It felt as if the academy itself was conspiring against us, pushing us to the brink. I could only hope that uncovering the truth would bring us some semblance of peace, though I feared what other horrors lay hidden in the shadows. The days dragged on with an almost unbearable tension. The more we uncovered, the more the academy seemed to close in on us. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, watching. Every creak in the old building, every flicker of light felt like a threat. One evening, Emily and I were going through old recordings in the archives. The sounds of the academy outside seemed distant, as if muffled by an unseen barrier. The recordings, though grainy, revealed something unsettling. They showed participants in the experiments exhibiting bizarre behavior, their eyes empty, their movements jerky and unnatural. My heart raced as I watched. These were people being driven to the edge of sanity, their minds twisted by the experiments. Emily whispered, "Do you think it's still happening? Are we seeing the same things those people did?" "I don't know," I replied, trying to steady my voice. "But whatever was done here has left a mark. We need to figure out what." That night, I had a vivid dream, or perhaps it was a waking vision. I was back in the archives, but the room was different. The walls were shifting, the documents melting into a dark puddle on the floor. I saw faces in the shadows, their eyes pleading. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. I had never felt so trapped, so suffocated. The next day, Michael's demeanor was off. He had been quiet for days, but now he was noticeably tense. I caught him pacing in the hallway. "Michael, what's going on?" I asked. He turned, eyes wide. "I saw something, last night, in my room. I'm not sure what it was, but it—" He paused, visibly shaken. It felt like it was inside my head, like it knew my deepest fears. I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear I felt gnawing at me. We decided to investigate the origin of the experiments more deeply. We needed to understand the methods and find any surviving records that might explain the strange occurrences. As we delved deeper, we uncovered an old, sealed file labeled Classified Final Results. The seal was broken, and the contents were far more disturbing than we expected. The file detailed a final phase of the experiments where subjects were subjected to extreme psychological stress, essentially creating a feedback loop of terror. The results were horrifying, permanent psychological damage. Reading this felt like a final, cruel joke. The experiments had created a lasting imprint on the academy, ensuring that anyone who came into contact with the files would suffer. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a deliberate trap. I looked at Emily and Michael. "We need to get out of here, now." But even as I said the words, I knew it was too late. The academy had already begun to show its true nature. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows thicker and darker. It was as if the building itself was alive, reacting to our fear. We fled from the archives, the hallways twisting and turning, becoming a maze with no exit. The more we ran, the more disoriented we became. Every door led to another dark corridor. Our panic grew, and it was clear we were trapped in a psychological maze, constructed to amplify our deepest fears. The final twist came when we finally reached the exit. As I opened the door, I was met not with the outside world, but with an empty room filled with mirrors. Each reflection showed not just our physical selves, but our most terrified expressions, frozen in a perpetual state of horror. We realized the truth too late. The academy was not just a building, it was a manifestation of the experiment's final, insidious phase. Our own fears and psychological scars were the real traps. We were no longer just investigating, we were part of the experiment's final, chilling demonstration. As the reflections grew darker and the walls seemed to close in, the realization set in. We were trapped not just in the academy, but in our own minds, forever haunted by the darkness that had been created. The academy's true horror was not what had been done to others, but what it had done to us.